Welcome to Bringing Romans to Life. I'm Preston Burrows, and in this lesson, we'll consider what subordination to governing authorities likely entails, and how love stands as a never-ending debt that Christians owe. Repeatedly in Romans, Paul has insisted that the recipients of his letter are not beholden to the law. Since the Greek word here either refers to any law or more specifically to the Jewish law, Torah, we need to pause and consider how the Jesus followers in Rome could have interpreted Paul's message. Especially in light of how Paul ended chapter 12, that they are to overcome evil with good, they may conclude that they are free from all laws, all constraints, as long as they do what they think is good. Yet, what Paul goes on to explain in chapter 13 makes it clear that the Jesus followers aren't free from all constraints, and certainly are not free from all consequences of their actions. Rather, they, like all living ones, are subjects under the authorities over them. In other words, they live under governing authorities. Conquering evil for good, then, is not a call to take up arms and attempt a violent revolution. Instead, as chapter 12 explained, they are to conquer evil through acts that subvert the status quo, that go against the norm. For example, Jesus' followers are to bless people who harass you, and not to take revenge. Chapter 12, verses 14 and 19. As religious minorities in the imperial capital, this came as timely and wise advice. Under the nose of the governing authorities, these Jesus followers stood in a vulnerable position, as illustrated in 64 CE, during Nero's deadly persecution of Christians. Given the hazards that could come with greater visibility, it's understandable that Paul would exhort Christians in Rome to submit themselves to the governing authorities. Now, for Paul, this is not just pragmatic advice. Instead, it's also theological. Yet his theological perspective likely raises serious questions in our minds. He goes on to say, "For there is no power except from God. Those that exist, or those that have been stationed, are from God." Chapter 13, verse 1. Now, throughout the centuries, this statement has often been deployed to keep subjects subjected, to prevent protest and unrest. And while we might wish Paul might have said something different, let's consider what he does say from a slightly different angle. It turns out that the statement is actually a little bit subversive, especially theologically. Contrary to the story the empire tells about itself, that it has been ordained by its gods to rule, Paul maintains that the governing authorities derive their power from the God of Israel, the Father of Jesus Christ, the man that the Romans crucified. To our ears, this may sound like Paul is saying God condones whatever the authorities do. Yet perhaps the vulnerable Christians in Rome could have heard it as indicating that God's power hemmed in and relativized the power of Roman authorities. It seems that from Paul's perspective, it is out of a recognition of God's ultimate power that Christians should submit to earthly rulers. Christians should obey governmental authorities, quote, not only to avoid God's punishment, but also for the sake of your conscience, 13 verse 5. In 13:3, Paul says something that on its surface appears to make a general universal claim about those who rule. that they only cause fear in those who do wrong and never in those who do what is good. In one way of rendering this verse, Paul says, quote, "For the rulers are not a terror to good deeds, but to bad. You wish not to fear the authority? Do the good, and you will receive the authority's approval." Chapter 13, verse 3. Yet let's keep in mind that this was written by a man who was flogged and had been beaten with rods. And that beating with rods is a specifically Roman form of punishment. We learn of Paul's experiences like this in 2 Corinthians 11. Paul had certainly experienced the wrath of the authorities by this point in his life. Wrath for having announced the gospel, the good news. And of course, this good news proclaimed a man as Messiah, whom Rome had crucified. So I would suggest that Paul does not naively say that rulers never terrorize good behavior. In fact, they may choose to do just this and at the same time overlook bad behavior. I would suggest instead that in Romans 13, Paul is not condoning every government, every ruling authority's response to its people's actions. And we can assume he does not expect Christians to obey every command, such as halting their proclamation of the gospel, or cursing Christ, or worshiping other gods. Thus, Paul's generalized command that Christians submit to authorities needs the type of communal discernment that he alludes to in Romans 12:2. So Paul wants the Jesus followers to recognize their subordinate position to authorities. But in addition to this, Paul exhorts them consistently to do what is right under a government that is expected to approve what is right. Paul names specific forms of obedience he expects the Jesus followers to perform, in particular, paying taxes and tolls and showing respect and giving honor. Paul exhorts the Jesus followers to be debt-free. They shouldn't owe anyone anything. All debts of honor and money should be paid. Yet, Paul says there's one debt they can never be rid of: the debt or obligation of loving one another. Chapter 13, verse 8. This obligation, of course, comes from the law in Leviticus 19:18. From Paul's perspective, quote, God expects people, as stressed in the law, Leviticus 19:18, to continue fulfilling this one commandment that comprises all others. Here stands Paul's clearest explanation of the Christian's relationship to the law. God's people fulfill the law when they love others, even as they properly love themselves. This chapter ends with a sense of urgency. All the instructions we've considered in chapters 12 and 13 apply, in Paul's view, in a time of urgency. Paul believed Jesus' triumphant return to his people and to his renewed creation would take place imminently. The moment of salvation was near. The time of self-indulgence was over. And the time of conforming fully to the pattern of Jesus was here. We likely have some powerful emotional responses to this chapter. I encourage you to reflect on this portion of Romans with the Living Scripture community.